Joseph Stalin did not like to wait, especially not for the end of the world. In the early hours of April 1945, inside the dimly lit, smoke-filled rooms of the Kremlin, the Soviet leader stood over a map that spanned the entire length of a heavy oak table. He wasn't looking at the front lines. He was looking at a single jagged circle drawn in red pencil. Berlin. His generals, men who had survived purges and freezing winters, stood in a semicircle, terrified to breathe too loudly. They had just handed him a report so sensitive it wasn't even typed. It was handwritten. Stalin read it, his eyes narrowing. He didn't scream. He didn't throw a tantrum. He simply put his pipe down and stared at a man across the table. What he whispered in that moment was never meant to leave that room. It wasn't a victory speech. It wasn't a cry of triumph. It was something much darker, a realization that would change the fate of the next 50 years. But to understand why the most powerful man in Eurasia was suddenly afraid of his own victory, we have to go back to the moment the illusion of control began to shatter. By mid-April, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, operated with the cold precision of a meat grinder. The plan was perfect. 2.5 million men, 6,000 tanks, more artillery than the world had ever seen in one place. Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konev, the two titans of the Red Army, weren't just fighting the Germans anymore. They were racing each other. Stalin had set it up that way, a psychological game of chess where the prize was the ruins of the Reichstag. In the war rooms, the mood was electric. Success wasn't a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. Logistics reports showed fuel lines stretching back to Moscow, shells being delivered by the millions, and a German army that was, on paper, already dead. The Soviet leadership believed they were the masters of time itself. They had calculated the exact hour the first shells would hit the city center. They had already drafted the surrender documents. They were so confident that they began discussing the post-war parade before the first soldier had even crossed the Oder River. Orders were simple: forward at any cost. Because when you have the world's largest army, cost is just a number on a ledger. What none of them realized, however, was that the map in front of them was lying. The first sign that something was off didn't come from a lost battle. It came from the silence. On April 16th, Zhukov launched his massive assault on the Seelow Heights, the gateway to Berlin. He used a psychological weapon, 143 searchlights intended to blind the defenders. But as the lights flickered on, something went wrong. Instead of illuminating the enemy, the light hit a wall of thick fog and smoke, reflecting back and blinding his own advancing troops. In the command bunkers, the reports started to lag. 10 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. When the news finally arrived, it didn't match the projections. The decimated German line wasn't breaking. The Soviet tanks were being picked off in a bottleneck. Zhukov, the man who had never lost his cool, began to pace. He looked at the casualty counts, numbers that shouldn't have been possible. One small detail was buried in the intelligence. The Germans had moved their primary defense line back just hours before the bombardment. The greatest artillery strike in history had hit empty trenches. Zhukov kept this detail from Stalin for as long as he could. It was a minor delay, he told himself, a glitch in the machine. But that decision to hide the truth, to maintain the illusion of the perfect plan, would haunt the high command within 48 hours. Stalin found out. He always found out. Instead of allowing his generals to pivot or regroup, Stalin did the one thing that guaranteed a bloodbath. He doubled down. He told Konev, Zhukov's rival, that if Zhukov couldn't take the city, Konev's forces would be allowed to pivot north and steal the glory. The race was no longer against the Germans. It was against each other. And the Soviet High Command entered a state of frantic escalation. Orders were issued to drive tanks through minefields rather than wait for engineers. If a bridge was blown, they were told to drive into the river and form a bridge of iron and corpses for the infantry to walk over. The gamble was clear: win fast enough that the losses don't matter. But as the Soviet circles tightened around Berlin, the intelligence began to report something terrifying. It wasn't just soldiers they were fighting, it was a city that had turned into a ghost. Reports reached the Kremlin of teenage boys and elderly men with anti-tank weapons hiding in cellars. The Soviet control was expanding on the map, but on the ground the officers were losing their grip on their own men. The violence was becoming primal. That's when the situation crossed the point of no return. This is what the textbooks leave out. While the world saw a triumphant Soviet Union closing the noose, the atmosphere inside the Soviet inner circle was one of mounting paranoia. In the private diaries of high-ranking aides, a different story emerges. During a late-night dinner at Stalin's dacha, as the encirclement of Berlin was completed, the Vozhd didn't toast to the end of the war. He sat in a corner, whispering to Beria, the head of the secret police. He wasn't worried about the Germans. He was worried about his own generals. He saw how the people cheered for Zhukov. He saw the power these men had gained through fire and blood. "We are building a monster," he reportedly whispered. He realized that the moment Berlin fell, the common enemy was gone. And without a common enemy, the men sitting around that table would start looking at him. The Soviet high command wasn't celebrating a victory. They were realizing they had just inherited a graveyard and a group of war heroes who might decide they didn't need a dictator anymore. But Stalin didn't say it out loud, not yet. He had one more card to play to ensure no one felt like a hero for long. As the red flag was raised over the Reichstag, the strategy shifted from warfare to survival, not for the Germans, but for the Soviet soul. The cost of the perfect encirclement was revealed. 300,000 Soviet casualties in just a few weeks. The city was a ruin. The liberators were now an occupying force in a land that hated them, led by generals who were now more popular than the government itself. Orders became reactions. Instead of a transition to peace, the high command began a systematic process of de-heroing. Zhukov was slowly pushed into the shadows. Reports of the atrocities in Berlin were suppressed, not to protect the soldiers, but to ensure the soldiers stayed afraid of the state. The strategic collapse wasn't a military one, it was a moral one. The Soviet leadership had won the war, but in the process, they had created a generation of men who had seen too much. And this wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the realization that the circle around Berlin had actually created a circle around themselves. They were now locked into a Cold War they hadn't planned for, with an army that was exhausted and a leader who was more suspicious than ever. This wasn't just a battle. It was the moment the Soviet elite realized that power has a breaking point. When the dust settled over the charred remains of the Führer bunker, the high command stood in the center of their prize. They had the maps, they had the city, they had the glory. But as they looked at the hollowed-out eyes of their own soldiers and the burning horizon of a divided Europe, the triumph felt empty. They had used brute force to solve a problem, only to realize that brute force creates 10 more problems in its wake. The whispers in the Kremlin changed from "how do we win" to "how do we survive the peace." The Berlin encirclement was the peak of Soviet military might, but it was also the beginning of the end for the men who led it. It revealed that you can surround a city, you can crush an empire, but you can never truly control the chaos you unleash to get there. So we have to ask, was the encirclement of Berlin a masterpiece of military strategy, the ultimate proof of Soviet strength? Or was it a desperate, ego-driven bloodbath that sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives just to satisfy the paranoia of a few men in a smoke-filled room? Some say the speed of the fall saved millions by ending the war early. Others argue the race for Berlin was a criminal waste of human life, driven by a desire for trophies rather than tactics. History has the dates, but it doesn't have the answer. What do you think? Was Stalin's whispered fear a sign of a genius who saw the future? Or the rambling of a man who had lost his humanity in the ruins of a city he didn't even want to visit? The comments are open. Let's see if we can agree on what the cost of victory really is.